I never imagined that my ruin would be waiting for me in a child's nursery, hidden inside a velvet box no larger than my palm. But there it was, gleaming in the afternoon light, a wedding ring engraved with initials I had spent 6 years trying to forget. The carriage that brought me to Ashford Manor had rattled through miles of countryside, past hedgerows thick with autumn berries and fields where the harvest had already been gathered. I had watched the landscape change from the narrow streets of London to the sprawling silence of the Derbyshire hills, and with every turn of the wheels, I had told myself that this was merely employment, nothing more. I was to be a governess to a duke's daughter, a position respectable enough to restore some measure of dignity to my name after years of living in my aunt's cramped townhouse, teaching piano to merchants' daughters for a few shillings a week. The manor itself rose from the valley like something out of a painting, all grey stone and tall windows that caught the last golden light of the day. I had expected grandeur, of course, but not this quiet magnificence, this sense of a house that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more, indifferent to the small dramas of the people who passed through its halls. The housekeeper, Mrs. Daventry, met me at the servants' entrance with a brisk efficiency that suggested she had seen many governesses come and go. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with silver hair pulled severely back and a face that might have been kind once before life in service had taught her to keep her expressions carefully neutral. She led me through a maze of corridors, up a narrow servants' staircase, and finally to a suite of rooms on the 3rd floor that would be mine and the child's. The nursery was larger than any room I had occupied in years, with windows overlooking the gardens and a fireplace already laid with wood, though not yet lit against the autumn chill. Miss Daventry gestured to the smaller adjoining room where I would sleep, then turned her attention to a writing desk near the window. "Your duties will begin tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, she said, her voice as clipped as her movements. "Lady Charlotte is 6 years old, though His Grace expects her to be instructed as if she were older. She is a sensitive child, given to tears, and she has had 3 governesses in the past 2 years. His Grace expects you to succeed where the others have failed." I nodded, though my heart had begun to beat faster at the mention of him. His Grace, the Duke of Ashford. I had not spoken his name aloud in 6 years, had trained myself not to think of him at all, and yet here I was, standing in his house, about to care for his daughter. When the letter had arrived offering me this position, I had very nearly refused it. But my aunt's patience had worn thin, and my options had dwindled to almost nothing. I had told myself that enough time had passed, that he would barely remember me, that I could perform my duties with professional detachment and nothing more. Mrs. Daventry continued speaking, listing the child's daily schedule, her preferences and aversions, the subjects I was expected to teach. I listened with half my attention, the other half occupied by the slow recognition of my surroundings. The nursery had clearly been redecorated recently, the wallpaper still fresh, the furniture chosen with care. There were dolls arranged on a shelf, books stacked neatly on a low table, a rocking horse with a braided mane. Everything spoke of a father who wished to provide well for his daughter, even if he could not provide the one thing she needed most. After Mrs. Daventry left, I stood alone in the center of the room and allowed myself to feel the full weight of my situation. I was here, in his house, employed by him, dependent upon his goodwill for my livelihood. The humiliation of it burned in my chest, but I pushed it down as I had learned to push down so many other feelings over the years. I crossed to the window and looked out at the gardens below, where the late roses were still blooming despite the cold nights. The ground stretched away toward a line of trees, and beyond that, I could just make out the shimmer of a lake. I turned back to the nursery and began to familiarize myself with its contents, opening drawers and examining shelves with the thoroughness my position required. It was in the 3rd drawer of a small chest beside the child's bed that I found it. The velvet box was tucked beneath a stack of embroidered handkerchiefs, and at first I thought it might contain some treasure of the child's, a special button or a lock of hair. But when I opened it, my breath stopped in my throat. 2 wedding rings lay nestled in the cream silk lining, side by side like a pair of sleeping birds. One was worn, the gold slightly dulled with age, and when I lifted it to the light, I saw an inscription inside. Eleanor, his late wife's name. The other ring was newer, the gold still bright, and when I turned it to read the inscription, my hands began to tremble. Catherine, my name, my initials, CMW, Catherine Margaret Weston. The room seemed to tilt around me, and I had to grip the edge of the chest to steady myself. This could not be. This was impossible. And yet there it was, undeniable proof that I had not been forgotten, that I had not been merely a passing inconvenience in his life. Someone had commissioned this ring, had it engraved with my name, had kept it all these years. But why? And why was it here, in his daughter's nursery, hidden like a secret or a shame? I closed the box with shaking hands and stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew I should put it back, should pretend I had never seen it, should focus on my duties and nothing more. But the questions burned in my mind, demanding answers I was not sure I wanted to hear. I thought of the girl I had been 6 years ago. Just turned 19, standing in my father's drawing room in a gown of pale blue silk, waiting for a man who never came. I thought of the letter that arrived instead, formal and brief, regretting to inform me that His Grace the Duke of Ashford had decided to withdraw his offer of marriage. No explanation, no apology. Just a cold retraction that left me standing there with my mother weeping and my father white with fury and shame. Within a week, the gossip had spread through London like wildfire. The Duke had fallen in love with someone else, they said. A woman of great beauty but no fortune. He had defied his family's expectations and married for love. And I had been cast aside like a garment that no longer fit. The scandal had been exquisite, the kind of story that people repeated at dinner parties for months afterward, and I had borne it all in silence, my face carefully composed, my dignity the only thing I had left. My father's health had declined rapidly after that, the stress and humiliation taking a toll he never recovered from. He died within the year, leaving debts that consumed what little remained of our estate. My mother followed him 6 months later, and I had gone to live with my aunt, a widow with barely enough income to support herself. I had learned to teach, to be useful, to accept charity disguised as employment. I had learned to stop hoping for anything more than survival. And now I was here, holding a wedding ring that should never have existed, in a house where I should never have set foot. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, quick and light, and I barely had time to replace the box and close the drawer before the door burst open. A small girl stood on the threshold, her dark curls escaping from their ribbons, her gray eyes enormous in her pale face. She wore a white dress with a blue sash, and she clutched a rag doll to her chest as if it were a shield. "You are the new governess," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Daventry said you would be here." I smoothed my skirts and tried to compose my expression, though my pulse was still racing. "Yes," I said, moving toward her slowly so as not to startle her. "My name is Miss Weston." "You must be Lady Charlotte." She nodded, then took a cautious step into the room. "Are you going to stay? The last one left after only 3 weeks. She said I was too difficult." I felt a pang of sympathy for this small, serious child who had already learned that people left. I knelt down so that I was at her eye level, ignoring the impropriety of it. "I do not think children are difficult," I said gently. "I think they are honest, and sometimes that makes adults uncomfortable." Something shifted in her expression, a slight softening around her eyes. She came closer, still clutching her doll. "Papa says I must have better manners. He says I must learn to behave like a young lady, not a wild creature." I smiled despite myself. "And what do you say?" "I say I do not want to be a lady. I want to climb trees and read adventure stories and keep frogs in jars." Well, I said, rising to my feet, perhaps we can find a way to do both. Good manners and adventure are not mutually exclusive, you know. She studied me with those solemn gray eyes, so much like her father's, and I felt my heart constrict. This child had lost her mother, and from what I could gather, her father was distant, consumed by his own grief. She needed someone who would see her, truly see her, and not merely try to mold her into something more convenient. "Will you read to me?" she asked suddenly. The others always said they would, but they never did. They were always too busy or too tired, or they said my books were too childish. I glanced at the shelf where her books were arranged. "Of course I will read to you. What would you like to hear?" She ran to the shelf and pulled out a worn volume, its cover faded from much handling. "This one," she said, bringing it to me with an eagerness that made her seem even younger than her 6 years. "It is about a girl who runs away to sea dressed as a boy." I took the book and settled into the chair by the fireplace, and she climbed into the chair opposite, her doll arranged carefully in her lap. As I began to read, my voice finding the rhythm of the story, I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. This, at least, I could do. This was a duty I could perform without reservation. The child listened with complete attention, her eyes fixed on my face, and for a little while, I allowed myself to forget about the rings hidden in the drawer, about the man who had destroyed my life, and then inexplicably kept a token of what might have been. But when the light began to fade, and I had to stop reading to light the lamps, Charlotte looked up at me with a question in her eyes. "Miss Weston," she said, "do you think Papa will ever be happy again?" The question caught me off guard, and I fumbled for an answer that would be both honest and appropriate. "I think your Papa has had a great sorrow," I said carefully, "but sorrow does not last forever. Perhaps in time he will find reasons to smile again." She considered this, her small face grave. "He used to smile more before Mama died. He used to pick me up and spin me around, and he would read to me every night. Now he is always in his study, and when I see him, he looks at me as if he is trying to remember something he has forgotten." I did not know what to say to that, so I simply reached out and touched her hand. "Perhaps he is sad because he misses your Mama very much. That does not mean he does not love you." She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Mrs. Daventry came then to take her down to supper, and I was left alone again in the nursery with the gathering darkness and the weight of too many questions. I lit the fire and sat before it, watching the flames catch and grow, and tried to make sense of everything I had learned. He had kept my ring. After everything, after the public rejection and the years of silence, he had commissioned a ring with my name on it, and kept it hidden in his daughter's nursery. Why? Was it guilt? Regret? Or something else entirely? Something I did not dare name? I knew I should not care. I knew that whatever his reasons, they changed nothing about what he had done to me, the humiliation he had caused, the life he had stolen from me. And yet I could not stop thinking about it, could not stop wondering what it meant that he had brought me here, of all the governesses in England, to care for his child. The next morning, I dressed carefully in my most severe gray dress and pinned my hair back with ruthless efficiency. I would be professional, I told myself. I would be competent and distant and entirely unremarkable. I would give him no reason to think I harbored any feelings about the past whatsoever. Charlotte appeared at 8 o'clock exactly, already dressed and with her hair neatly braided, though I suspected Mrs. Daventry had done it for her. We began with penmanship, which she approached with grim determination, her tongue caught between her teeth as she formed her letters. Then geography, where she proved to have a surprisingly good memory for capital cities and rivers. By the time we broke for her mid-morning walk in the gardens, I was cautiously optimistic that we might manage well together. It was as we were returning from the gardens, Charlotte's cheeks pink from the cold air and her spirits visibly lifted, that we encountered him in the main hall. He was coming from the direction of his study, dressed for riding in boots and a dark coat, and he stopped when he saw us, his hand still on the handle of the study door. For a moment, we simply looked at each other across the expanse of polished floor, and I felt the years collapse between us. He looked older, of course, the lines around his eyes deeper, his face harder somehow, as if grief had chiseled away everything soft. But his eyes were the same, that particular shade of gray that could look silver in certain lights. And when they met mine, I saw something flicker there that might have been recognition or regret, or simply surprise. "Papa," Charlotte said, breaking the silence, "this is Miss Weston. She read to me yesterday, and this morning we studied geography. Did you know that the Nile is the longest river in the world?" He tore his gaze from mine and looked down at his daughter, and his expression softened slightly. "I did know that," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered. "I am glad you are learning well." Then he looked back at me, and I forced myself to meet his eyes with what I hoped was professional composure. "Miss Weston," he said, and there was something in the way he said my name that made my pulse quicken. "I trust you are settling in adequately?" "Yes, Your Grace," I said, my voice cool and steady. "Lady Charlotte is a delightful pupil." He nodded, but his eyes did not leave my face, and I had the unsettling feeling that he was searching for something, some sign or answer to a question he had not asked. "I see," he said finally. "If you require anything, you need only ask Mrs. Daventry." "Thank you, Your Grace," I said, and I turned to lead Charlotte toward the stairs, my back straight and my hands steady despite the turmoil in my chest. But before we reached the landing, I heard him speak again, his voice carrying up the stairwell. "Miss Weston." I stopped and looked back, and he was standing at the bottom of the stairs, one hand on the banister, his expression unreadable. "I would like to speak with you this evening, if you would be so kind. In my study, after Lady Charlotte has gone to bed." It was not a request, despite the polite phrasing. "Of course, Your Grace," I said. And then I continued up the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain Charlotte could hear it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of lessons and meals and the small rituals of a child's routine. I read to Charlotte again in the afternoon, and she fell asleep during the story, her head drooping against the arm of the chair, her doll sliding from her lap. I carried her to her bed and tucked her in, and for a moment I stood looking down at her peaceful face and felt an unexpected tenderness. Whatever else happened, I would do right by this child. She deserved that much. At 8 o'clock, after Charlotte was safely asleep and the nursery was quiet, I made my way down to the ground floor and found the Duke's study. The door was ajar, and I could see the glow of lamplight within. I knocked softly, and his voice called for me to enter. The study was a masculine room, all dark wood and leather, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive desk positioned before the windows. He was standing by the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantelpiece, and he turned when I entered. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, and I was acutely aware of the impropriety of being alone with him in this room. The door closed behind me, the rest of the house distant and silent. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, and I noticed that he did not move away from the fireplace as if he needed its support. "I wanted to speak with you about Charlotte, and about other matters." I clasped my hands in front of me and waited, determined not to make this easier for him. He cleared his throat and looked down at the fire. "When I learned that you had applied for the position, I was surprised. I had thought you were living with family in London." "I was," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "My circumstances changed. I needed employment." He nodded slowly, and I saw his jaw tighten. "I want you to know that I did not bring you here to cause you further distress. I brought you here because Charlotte needs someone who will care about her as a person, not merely as a duty, and I thought you might be that person." His words surprised me, and I found myself responding before I could think better of it. "Why would you think that?" "You do not know me, Your Grace. You never bothered to know me." Something flashed in his eyes. Pain or anger, I could not tell. "That is not entirely true," he said quietly. "I knew you well enough to know that you were kind, that you had a gentle spirit, that you deserved far better than what I gave you." The admission hung in the air between us, and I felt my carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "If you knew that," I said, and my voice was shaking now, "then why did you do it? Why did you humiliate me in front of all of London? Why did you leave me to bear the shame alone?" He turned to face me fully, and I could see the anguish in his face. "Because I was a coward," he said, "because I fell in love with someone else, and I did not have the courage to face you and tell you the truth. I sent that letter because I could not bear to see the hurt in your eyes when I broke my promise. I told myself it would be kinder that way, cleaner. But I know now that I was wrong. I have known it for 6 years. I stood there, my hands clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. "And now?" I asked. "What do you want from me now?" He took a step toward me, then stopped, as if remembering himself. "I want you to care for my daughter," he said. "I want you to give her the attention and affection she desperately needs. And perhaps, in time, I want you to forgive me, though I know I have no right to ask it." I looked at him, this man who had once been the center of all my hopes, and felt the complicated tangle of emotions I had tried so hard to bury rising up in my throat. "I cannot promise forgiveness," I said, "but I can promise to do my best for Charlotte. She is innocent in all of this." He nodded, and I thought I saw relief in his eyes. "That is all I ask," he said. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, I stopped. "Your Grace," I said, not looking back at him, "there is a velvet box in the nursery. It contains 2 wedding rings." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the crackle of the fire. Then, very quietly, he said, "You found them." I did. "One belonged to your wife. The other has my name engraved inside it." Another long silence. Then he said, "I had it made shortly after I married Eleanor. I told myself it was simply to have it done with, to settle the matter completely. But the truth is, I could not bear to let you go entirely. Keeping that ring was my way of holding on to something I had thrown away. I know it makes no sense. I know it changes nothing." I closed my eyes and pressed my hand against the door frame. "Why is it in Charlotte's nursery?" "Because that is where I keep the things I cannot afford to forget," he said. "The things that remind me of my failures and my responsibilities. Eleanor's ring is there to remind me of the love I lost through my own negligence. Yours is there to remind me of the woman I wronged beyond all measure." I opened the door and stepped into the corridor, my heart breaking and mending and breaking again all at once. "Good night, Your Grace," I said, and I walked away before he could see the tears that were finally, after 6 long years, beginning to fall. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed in the room adjoining the nursery and listened to the house settle around me, the old timbers creaking, the wind rattling the window panes. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 2 rings lying side by side in their velvet box, and I heard his voice saying that he had kept mine as a reminder of his failure. I did not know what to do with that knowledge, how to reconcile it with the anger I had carried for so long. By the time dawn broke, I had resolved to maintain my distance, to perform my duties with competence and nothing more. Whatever his reasons for bringing me here, whatever complicated emotions drove him to keep that ring, they were his burden to bear, not mine. I had survived 6 years without him. I could survive however many more it took until Charlotte no longer needed me, and I could find another position somewhere far from Derbyshire. Charlotte was awake early, sitting up in her bed with her doll when I entered the nursery. She looked at me with those serious gray eyes and asked if I had slept well. I lied and said I had, then helped her dress and braid her hair. We went down to breakfast in the nursery, where Mrs. Daventry had arranged a tray with porridge and toast and a pot of weak tea. Charlotte ate slowly, pushing the porridge around her bowl, and I wondered if she always had such little appetite, or if something was troubling her. "Are you unhappy here?" I asked gently, sitting across from her at the small table. She looked up, startled. "No, Miss Weston, why do you ask? You seem quiet this morning, and you are not eating much." She set down her spoon and folded her hands in her lap, a gesture that seemed far too mature for a child of 6. "I am always quiet," she said. "Mama used to say I was born old, that I came into the world already knowing too much." I felt a pang of sadness for this child who had learned to be solemn when she should have been carefree. "What sorts of things did you and your mama do together?" I asked, hoping to draw her out. For a moment, her face brightened. "We used to walk in the gardens every afternoon, and she would teach me the names of all the flowers. She said that every flower had a meaning, a secret language that people used long ago. Roses for love, forget-me-nots for remembrance, lily of the valley for the return of happiness." "That is beautiful," I said. "Would you like to walk in the gardens this afternoon and see what is still blooming?" She nodded eagerly, and I saw a glimpse of the child she might have been if grief had not touched her so young. We spent the morning on lessons, working through arithmetic and French vocabulary, and I was pleased to discover that she had a quick mind when something interested her. She struggled with sums but excelled at languages, and she could recite poetry with a feeling that suggested she truly understood the words, not merely memorized them. After lunch, we put on our cloaks and went out into the gardens. The afternoon was cold but clear, the sky a pale crystalline blue, and the gardens were still beautiful despite the lateness of the season. Charlotte led me along the gravel paths, pointing out the places where her mother's favorite flowers had grown. Here were the roses, their last blooms clinging stubbornly to thorny stems. There was the border where the lavender had been, now brown and dormant. And beyond, near a small stone bench beneath a willow tree, was a patch where primroses would appear in spring. "Mama and I used to sit on that bench," Charlotte said, her voice wistful. "She would bring a book and read to me, and sometimes we would just sit and watch the birds. Papa would join us sometimes, before she got sick. He would bring papers from his study and pretend to work, but really he was just listening to Mama read." I looked at the bench and tried to imagine the scene she described, this family together and whole. It hurt more than I expected, knowing that he had found that happiness with someone else, that he had built a life and lost it, while I had been living in my aunt's townhouse teaching scales to untalented children. "Do you miss her very much?" I asked, though I knew the answer. Charlotte nodded, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. "Every day," she whispered, "but I am not supposed to cry. Papa says it upsets the servants, and that I must learn to be brave." I knelt down beside her and pulled her into my arms, and she clung to me with a fierceness that broke my heart. "You may cry whenever you need to," I said softly. "Bravery does not mean never feeling sad. It means feeling sad and continuing anyway." She sobbed against my shoulder, and I held her and let her grieve, this small girl who had lost so much. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back and looked at me with swollen eyes. "Thank you, Miss Weston," she said. "The other governesses always told me to stop crying. They said it was unbecoming." "They were wrong," I said firmly. "There is nothing unbecoming about grief." We walked back to the house slowly, and Charlotte slipped her hand into mine. It was such a simple gesture, but it filled me with a protective tenderness that I had not expected to feel. Whatever complicated history existed between her father and me, this child was innocent, and she deserved someone who would let her be human. That evening, after I had put Charlotte to bed and read her a story about a brave princess who rescued herself from a tower, I returned to my room and found a letter waiting on my writing desk. It was sealed with the Duke's crest, and my hands trembled slightly as I broke the wax and unfolded the heavy paper. The handwriting was bold and masculine, the letters formed with the careless confidence of someone accustomed to having their words heeded. "Miss Weston," it began, "I find myself compelled to write what I could not adequately express in person. I want you to understand why I asked you to come here, beyond the reasons I have already given. When Eleanor died, I thought I would die too. The grief was so immense that I could not imagine continuing. But Charlotte needed me, and so I did continue, though I fear I have done her a great disservice. I have been absent even when present, lost in my own sorrow, and she has suffered for it. I needed someone who would see her, truly see her, and care for her as more than a duty. I thought of you because I remembered your kindness, even though I had forfeited any right to call upon it. But there is another reason, one I am less proud of. I wanted to see you again. I wanted to know if the woman I wronged had survived, if she had found happiness despite what I did. And perhaps, in some twisted way, I wanted to atone. I know that nothing I do can undo the past, but I thought that if I could give you employment, security, a place where you would be valued, it might ease some small measure of my guilt. I realize now how arrogant that was, how presumptuous. You do not owe me anything, least of all absolution. But I want you to know that if you choose to stay, it will be because of Charlotte's need and your own willingness, not because of any obligation to me. And if you choose to leave, I will provide you with references that will secure you any position you desire and a sum sufficient to keep you comfortable while you search. I remain, in deepest regret, Ashford. I read the letter 3 times, trying to parse the emotions behind the formal words. He had wanted to see me again. He had thought of me, wondered about me, even after all these years. Part of me was furious at his presumption, at the idea that he could summon me here and expect gratitude for the opportunity to serve in his household. But another part, a part I did not want to acknowledge, was touched by his honesty, by the raw admission of his failures. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of my writing desk beside my few other possessions. Then I sat by the window and looked out at the darkened gardens, trying to decide what I felt. The truth was that I did not want to leave. Charlotte needed me, and I found that I needed her too. This small girl who had awakened something in me that I thought had died years ago, the capacity to care, to hope, to believe that I could make a difference in someone's life. As for the Duke, I did not know what to think of him. He was not the villain I had made him in my mind over the years, the cold and heartless man who had discarded me without a thought. He was something more complicated, a man who had made choices he regretted, who had loved and lost, and was trying, however imperfectly, to do better. I did not forgive him. I was not sure I could. But perhaps I could understand him, just a little. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Charlotte and I spent our mornings on lessons, our afternoons walking in the gardens or reading by the nursery fire, and our evenings with quiet games and stories. She began to open up to me, to share small confidences and fears, and I found myself growing genuinely fond of her. She was clever and sensitive, and far too aware of the sadness around her. But she was also resilient, capable of joy when given the chance to experience it. I saw the Duke rarely, and when I did, our interactions were brief and formal. He would ask after Charlotte's progress, and I would give him a measured report. He would thank me, and I would curtsy and withdraw. But I was always aware of him, of his presence in the house, the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, the low murmur of his voice when he met with his steward or his solicitor. And sometimes, when I was alone in the nursery after Charlotte was asleep, I would take out the velvet box and look at the 2 rings, trying to understand what they meant. It was nearly 3 weeks after my arrival that everything changed. Charlotte had been quieter than usual that morning, complaining of a headache, and by afternoon she had developed a fever. I sent for Mrs. Daventry, who took one look at the child's flushed cheeks and glassy eyes and immediately sent for the doctor. While we waited, I bathed Charlotte's face with cool cloths and tried to keep her comfortable, but her fever continued to rise, and she began to cry out in her sleep, tossing and turning beneath the blankets. The doctor arrived in the early evening, a gray-haired man with a brisk manner and gentle hands. He examined Charlotte thoroughly, asking me questions about when the symptoms had started and whether she had been exposed to anyone who was ill. Finally, he straightened and looked at me with concern. "It is a fever, most likely brought on by a chill. These things can be dangerous in young children, but with proper care, she should recover. You must keep her cool and give her plenty of water. I will leave a tonic to help bring down the fever." I nodded, my throat tight with worry. The doctor spoke briefly with Mrs. Daventry, then departed, and I was left alone with Charlotte, who had fallen into a restless sleep. I pulled a chair close to her bed and settled in to watch over her, determined not to leave her side until the fever broke. Hours passed. The house grew quiet around me, the servants retiring to their quarters, the lamps in the corridors extinguished one by one. I dozed fitfully in the chair, waking every time Charlotte stirred or cried out. Her fever remained high, and I continued to bathe her face and arms with cool water, whispering soothing words, even though I was not sure she could hear me. It was past midnight when the door to the nursery opened and the Duke entered. He was still dressed, though his cravat was loosened and his hair disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it. He crossed to the bed and looked down at his daughter, his face stricken. "How is she?" he asked, his voice rough. "The fever has not broken," I said, "but the doctor said she should recover with proper care." He pulled another chair close to the bed and sat down, and for a while we kept vigil together in silence. I was acutely aware of his presence, the way he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. He looked like a man enduring torture, and I realized that he was reliving the loss of his wife, terrified that history would repeat itself. "She will be all right," I said softly. "Children are resilient." He looked at me, and in the dim light of the single lamp, his eyes were full of anguish. "Eleanor's illness started like this," he said, "a fever that would not break. And then it got worse, and worse, until there was nothing anyone could do. I reached out, almost without thinking, and placed my hand over his. 'Charlotte is young and strong,' I said. 'This is not the same.' He stared at our joined hands for a long moment, then turned his hand over and gripped mine as if it were a lifeline. 'I cannot lose her too,' he said, his voice breaking. 'She is all I have left.' 'You will not lose her,' I said, though I could not be certain. 'But I promise you, I will do everything in my power to care for her.' He nodded, and a single tear escaped down his cheek before he wiped it away roughly. 'I am sorry,' he said. 'I am sorry for bringing you into this, for asking you to bear witness to my failures once again.' I squeezed his hand, and something shifted between us, some barrier that had been carefully maintained crumbling away. 'You are not failing,' I said. 'You are here. That is what matters.' We sat together through the long hours of the night, taking turns bathing Charlotte's face and checking her temperature. We did not speak much, but the silence between us was no longer hostile or uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people united by a common purpose, a shared fear, and perhaps, beneath it all, a tentative understanding. As dawn began to break, Charlotte's fever finally started to subside. Her skin grew cooler to the touch, and her breathing became easier. She opened her eyes and looked at us with confusion, as if she could not quite remember where she was. "Papa?" she whispered. "Miss Weston?" "We are here," the Duke said, leaning forward and brushing the damp curls from her forehead. "You have been ill, but you are going to be well now." She smiled weakly, then closed her eyes again and drifted into a peaceful sleep. The Duke sagged back in his chair, the tension draining from his body, and I felt my own exhaustion catch up with me. We had done it. She was past the worst of it. "Thank you," the Duke said, turning to look at me. "I do not know what I would have done without you." I met his gaze and saw something there that I had not seen before. Gratitude, yes, but also something warmer, something that made my heart beat faster. "You would have managed," I said. "You love her. That is enough." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Love is not always enough. I loved Eleanor desperately, and I could not save her. I thought love would protect us from everything, but it did not. And when she died, I learned that love can be a weakness, a vulnerability that makes you helpless in the face of loss. I understood what he was saying, understood the fear that drove him to keep his distance from his daughter, to build walls around his heart. But I also knew that it was the wrong lesson to draw from tragedy. Love is not a weakness, I said gently. It is the only thing that makes any of this bearable. He looked at me for a long time, and I saw something in his expression soften. Perhaps you are right, he said. Perhaps I have been wrong about many things. The moment hung between us, fragile and full of possibility, and I did not know what to do with it. Then Charlotte stirred in her sleep, and we both turned our attention back to her, and the moment passed. Over the days that followed, Charlotte recovered slowly. Her fever did not return, and her appetite gradually improved. The Duke visited the nursery every day, sometimes twice a day, and he would sit with Charlotte and read to her or simply hold her hand while she slept. I watched them together and saw the distance between them beginning to close, saw him learning how to be a father again. And as I watched, I felt something within me beginning to shift as well. The anger I had carried for so long was still there, but it was no longer the only thing I felt when I looked at him. There was also compassion and curiosity, and something else I did not want to name. I told myself it was merely sympathy, merely the natural softening that comes from seeing someone in pain. But late at night, when I was alone in my room, I could not lie to myself. I was beginning to care for him again, not as the fantasy figure I had been betrothed to all those years ago, but as the real, flawed, complicated man he had become. It terrified me. I had survived losing him once by hardening my heart, by refusing to feel anything at all. But now, those careful defenses were crumbling, and I did not know how to stop it. I did not know if I even wanted to. One afternoon, when Charlotte was well enough to sit up in bed and work on a simple puzzle, the Duke asked if he might speak with me privately. We left Charlotte in Mrs. Daventry's care and walked down to his study. And once again, I found myself in that book-lined room with the door closed behind us. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, my hands clasped before me. Whatever he had to say, I wanted to hear it without the pretense of casual conversation. He seemed to understand, because he did not sit either. Instead, he moved to stand before the fireplace, his back to the flames, and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I have been thinking a great deal these past weeks, he said, about the past, about my choices, about the kind of man I have become. And I have come to realize that I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation. I said nothing, simply waited, and he continued. When I met Eleanor, it was at a time when I believed I had my entire life planned out. I would marry you, as our families had arranged, and we would have a respectable, comfortable life together. It was not a passionate prospect, but it was acceptable. And then I met her, and everything I thought I knew about myself proved to be false. He paused, and I could see the pain in his face. She was a vicar's daughter, with no fortune and no connections, but she was unlike anyone I had ever known. She was joyful and curious and utterly without pretense. When I was with her, I felt truly alive for the first time, and I fell in love with her so completely that I could not imagine marrying anyone else. I know, I said quietly. Everyone knew. It was the scandal of the season. He flinched. I handled it abominably. I know that. I should have come to you in person, should have been honest and faced the consequences of my choice. But I was terrified of hurting you. And in my cowardice, I hurt you far more than honesty ever would have. Yes, I said, and the word came out harder than I intended. You did. He nodded, accepting the accusation. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot give you back the years you lost or erase the shame you endured. But I want you to know that my time with Eleanor, as brief as it was, taught me something about the kind of love that makes you better, that challenges you to be worthy of it. And I want you to know that I have thought of you often over the years, wondered if you found that kind of love, hoped that you did. I looked at him, this man who had once destroyed me and who now stood before me asking for understanding. I did not find it, I said. I found only survival. And I learned to be content with that. He took a step toward me, and I saw something like anguish in his eyes. I wish I could change it, he said. I wish I could go back and choose differently, be braver, be kinder. But I cannot. All I can do is try to be better now, for Charlotte's sake, and perhaps, if you will allow it, for yours as well. What are you asking me? I said, my voice trembling. I am asking if you can ever forgive me, he said. Not today, perhaps not even soon, but someday. I am asking if we might start again, as two people who have both suffered loss, and see if something good can come from all this pain. I stood there, my heart pounding, and I knew that this was the moment that would define everything that came after. I could refuse, could maintain my distance and my dignity, could finish my time here and leave with my pride intact. Or I could take a chance, could allow myself to be vulnerable again, could risk everything for the possibility of something I had given up hoping for. I need time, I said finally. I need to think. He nodded, and I saw relief and disappointment warring in his expression. Of course, he said. Take all the time you need. I will not press you. I left the study and walked back to the nursery in a daze. Charlotte was asleep, her puzzle abandoned on the coverlet, and I sat in the chair by her bed and tried to sort through the chaos of my emotions. He had asked for forgiveness, but more than that, he had asked for a chance. And against all reason, against all the lessons I had learned about protecting my heart, I found that I wanted to give it to him. But wanting something and being wise enough to take it were two different things entirely, and I did not yet know which path I would choose. The weeks that followed Charlotte's illness were marked by a subtle shift in the household, as if something that had been held in suspension for years had finally been released. The Duke continued to visit the nursery daily, and his interactions with his daughter grew warmer, more natural. He would arrive in the late afternoon, sometimes bringing small gifts, a new book or a ribbon for her hair, and he would stay for an hour or more, listening to her recite her lessons or simply sitting with her while I read aloud. I had not given him an answer to his question, and he did not press me. But I felt the weight of it constantly, the unspoken possibility hanging between us like a held breath. Sometimes I would look up from a book and find him watching me with an expression I could not quite read, and I would feel my pulse quicken despite my determination to remain cautious. Charlotte, oblivious to the undercurrents between her father and me, blossomed under the increased attention. Her appetite returned, and with it some of the liveliness that I suspected had been missing since her mother's death. She laughed more easily, asked more questions, and even dared to be occasionally disobedient in the way that healthy children are, testing boundaries to see where they stood. One morning she announced that she did not want to practice her penmanship and would rather go outside to look for birds' nests. I told her gently but firmly that we would do penmanship first and birds' nests afterward, and she pouted for exactly 3 minutes before sighing dramatically and picking up her pen. When her father arrived that afternoon and she told him about the incident, I braced myself for criticism, but he only smiled and said that it sounded as though Miss Weston had matters well in hand. It was the first time I had seen him truly smile, and the transformation was remarkable. The hard lines of his face softened, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the younger man he must have been, before grief had carved its marks into him. I felt something twist in my chest, something dangerously close to longing, and I quickly turned away to busy myself with straightening the books on the shelf. That evening, after Charlotte was asleep, I found another letter on my desk. This time, the seal was already broken, as if he had changed his mind several times before finally deciding to send it. Miss Weston, it read, I find that I cannot continue in this liminal state, waiting for an answer that may never come, so I will make a different request instead. Will you walk with me tomorrow afternoon, after Charlotte's lessons? There is something I wish to show you, and I promise it requires no decision on your part, no commitment beyond an hour of your time. I held the letter and debated with myself. Every instinct of self-preservation told me to refuse, to maintain the professional distance that was my only protection. But another part of me, the part that had come alive again in these weeks at Ashford Manor, wanted desperately to say yes. I wanted to walk with him, to talk with him as something more than Charlotte's governess and her employer. I wanted to know what he wished to show me, and more than that, I wanted to know if the connection I felt growing between us was real or merely the product of proximity and shared care for his daughter. In the end, I wrote a brief reply and left it with Mrs. Daventry to deliver. Yes, I will walk with you tomorrow afternoon. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Charlotte seemed to sense my distraction and kept asking if I was feeling well, and I had to work to keep my attention on her lessons. Finally, the afternoon arrived, and the Duke appeared at the nursery door precisely at 3 o'clock. He was dressed for walking, in boots and a dark coat, and he carried a heavy cloak over his arm. "It is cold today," he said, offering me the cloak. "I thought you might need this." I accepted it, noting that it was too fine to be a servant's cloak, and realized it must have belonged to his late wife. The thought gave me pause, but he seemed not to notice my hesitation. Charlotte looked up from her drawing and smiled at us. "Are you going to show Miss Weston the lake, Papa?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and something in his voice suggested that the lake held significance I did not yet understand. "Will you be good for Mrs. Daventry while we are gone?" Charlotte nodded solemnly, and I kissed her forehead before following the Duke out of the nursery. We walked in silence through the house and out into the gardens, our breath forming clouds in the cold air. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain, and the bare trees stood stark against the gray expanse. It was not a day that invited walking, but I found I did not mind. There was something fitting about the bleakness, something that matched the complicated emotions I carried. We followed a path that led away from the formal gardens toward the line of trees I had glimpsed from the nursery window. As we walked, the Duke began to speak, his voice low and measured. "When Eleanor died," he said, "I could not bear to be in the house. Every room reminded me of her, every object held some memory that cut like a knife. So I would come here, to the lake, and sit for hours. Sometimes Charlotte would come with me, but more often I came alone." We emerged from the trees, and I saw the lake spread before us, its surface dark and still beneath the clouded sky. It was larger than I had imagined, perhaps a quarter-mile across, with a small island in the center where a few wind-twisted trees clung to the rocky ground. At the near shore, there was a wooden bench positioned to look out over the water, and beyond it, a small stone folly built to resemble a classical temple, its columns gray with age and lichen. The Duke led me to the bench, and we sat down side by side. "This was Eleanor's favorite place," he said. "She used to say that the lake changed with every season, every hour, every shift of light, and that she could never tire of watching it. After she died, I had that bench placed here, and I commissioned the folly to be built as a memorial to her. I wanted something beautiful and permanent, something that would outlast grief." I looked at the folly and felt a complicated mix of emotions. It was undeniably lovely, even in its weathered state, but it also represented everything I was not. Eleanor had been loved so completely that her husband had built her a monument. What had I ever inspired but regret? As if reading my thoughts, the Duke turned to me. "I did not bring you here to make you feel inadequate," he said quietly. "I brought you here because I wanted you to understand something. For 2 years, I have come to this place to remember Eleanor and to mourn what I lost. But recently, I have found myself coming here for a different reason." "What reason?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "To think about the future," he said. "To imagine what life might be like if I allowed myself to hope again. And every time I do, I find myself thinking of you." I turned to look at him, and I saw vulnerability in his eyes, a nakedness that took my breath away. "Why?" I asked. "Why me, after everything?" He reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm despite the cold. "Because you are kind without being weak. Because you are strong without being hard. Because when I watch you with Charlotte, I see the kind of mother she needs, the kind of woman I should have recognized years ago when I was too foolish and selfish to appreciate what I had." I felt tears prick my eyes, and I tried to pull my hand away, but he held it gently. "You loved Eleanor," I said. "You built her a temple. How can you speak of moving forward when her memory is everywhere?" "I did love her," he said, "and I will always love the memory of what we had. But Eleanor is gone, and I am still here, and so is Charlotte. And I have learned these past weeks that it is possible to honor the past without being imprisoned by it. Eleanor would not have wanted me to spend the rest of my life in mourning. She was too full of life herself to wish that on anyone." "What are you asking me?" I said, though I thought I knew. "I am asking if you can imagine a future here," he said, "not as Charlotte's governess, but as something more. I am asking if, despite everything I have done, despite all the pain I caused you, you might consider giving me a chance to prove that I have learned to be a better man." I sat there, the cold seeping through my cloak, and I thought about all the years I had spent being careful, being safe, protecting myself from the possibility of being hurt again. I thought about the girl I had been at 19, standing in her father's drawing room waiting for a bridegroom who never came. And I thought about the woman I had become, shaped by loss and disappointment into someone harder, more cautious. But I also thought about Charlotte, who had brought out a tenderness in me I had not known I still possessed. I thought about the Duke's hand holding mine, the warmth of it, the steadiness. I thought about the way he looked at me sometimes, as if I were something precious and fragile that he was afraid of breaking. And I realized that I did not want to be safe anymore. I wanted to be brave. "I cannot promise you anything," I said slowly. "I cannot promise that I will ever forget what you did, or that I will ever trust you completely. The wound you caused was deep, and it has not fully healed." "I know," he said, and I could hear the pain in his voice. "I am not asking for promises. I am only asking for a chance." I looked out at the lake, at the gray water and the distant folly, and I made my decision. "Then you have it," I said. "But I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we try this, it cannot be a repetition of what came before. I will not be the woman who waits patiently while you make up your mind. I will not be the second choice, the consolation prize. If you want me, you must want me fully, without reservation." He turned to face me fully, and I saw something like wonder in his eyes. "You were never the second choice," he said. "You were the choice I was too immature to make when I had the chance. And if you give me the opportunity, I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." We sat together in the cold afternoon, holding hands like tentative conspirators, and I felt the first fragile stirrings of hope. I did not know where this would lead, did not know if we could truly overcome the past. But for the first time in 6 years, I allowed myself to believe that happiness might be possible. The rain began to fall as we walked back to the house, light at first and then heavier, and we ran the last 100 yards, laughing like children. When we reached the shelter of the entrance hall, we were both soaked, and Mrs. Daventry appeared with towels and a horrified expression that suggested we had violated several laws of propriety. But I did not care. I felt alive in a way I had not felt in years, reckless and exhilarated and terrified all at once. That evening, after Charlotte was asleep, I sat at my writing desk and tried to put my thoughts into words. But everything I wrote seemed inadequate, too dramatic or too restrained, and finally I gave up and simply sat there, watching the fire burn low in the grate. I was taking an enormous risk, I knew, I was placing my heart in the hands of a man who had already broken it once. But I was also giving myself permission to want something more than mere survival. The weeks that followed were strange and wonderful. The Duke and I began spending time together in the evenings after Charlotte was in bed. Sometimes we would sit in the library and talk, sharing stories about our childhoods, our disappointments, our dreams. Sometimes we would simply sit in comfortable silence, reading or working on correspondence. He told me about Eleanor, about their courtship and marriage, about the joy she had brought to his life and the devastation of losing her. And I told him about my years in London, about my father's death and my mother's grief, about the slow erosion of hope that had accompanied my descent into poverty. It was not always easy. There were moments when old resentments would surface, when I would say something sharp and he would flinch, and we would have to work through the anger and hurt before we could continue. But we did continue, and slowly, painfully, we began to build something new on the ruins of what had been destroyed. Charlotte, observant child that she was, noticed the change in her father's demeanor. He smiled more, laughed more, and he began to take a more active role in her daily life. He would join us for lessons sometimes, or take her riding in the afternoons. And she, in turn, began to show him the affection she had been holding back, climbing into his lap or taking his hand spontaneously. It was healing for both of them, I thought, this gradual knitting together of their fractured relationship. One evening in early December, when the first snow had begun to fall, the Duke asked if I would join him in his study. I went, curious and a little apprehensive, and found him standing by the window watching the snow drift past the glass. He turned when I entered, and I saw that he was holding the velvet box, the one that contained the 2 rings. "I have been thinking about these," he said, setting the box on his desk, "about what they represent and what I want them to represent going forward." I moved closer, my heart beginning to race. "What do you mean?" He opened the box and took out Eleanor's ring, holding it up to the lamplight. "This ring represents a love that was real and beautiful and complete in its time," he said. "But its time is past. Eleanor is gone, and while I will always cherish her memory, I cannot continue to live as though she might return." He placed the ring carefully back in the box, then picked up the other ring, the one with my name engraved inside. "And this ring," he said, "represents a promise that was broken and a future that was lost. But I would like to give it a new meaning." He turned to me, and I saw that his hands were shaking slightly. "Catherine," he said, and hearing him speak my given name sent a shock through me. "I know it is too soon. I know you need more time, and I do not want to rush you. But I want you to know that when you are ready, if you are ever ready, I would be honored if you would consent to become my wife." I stared at him, too stunned to speak. He was proposing, or rather, stating his intention to propose when the time was right. It was both more and less than I had expected, and I did not know how to respond. "You do not need to answer now," he said quickly, seeing my expression. "I only wanted you to know where my heart lies. I wanted you to understand that this is not a whim or a passing fancy. I want to build a life with you, Catherine. I want Charlotte to have a mother who loves her, and I want to give you the life you should have had 6 years ago." I took the ring from his hand and looked at it, at the inscription that had been waiting all this time. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to let go of all the caution and fear and simply accept what he was offering. But another part, the part that had been burned before, held back. "Ask me again in the spring," I said finally, "when the primroses bloom in Eleanor's garden. If you still feel the same then, ask me again, and I will give you my answer." He nodded, and I saw relief in his eyes that I had not refused him outright. "I can wait," he said. "I have waited 6 years already. A few more months will not matter." I handed the ring back to him, and he placed it carefully in the box. But instead of closing the lid, he reached for Eleanor's ring and held it for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I think it is time to lay this to rest," he said. "Not to forget her, but to release her. Would you come with me tomorrow to the lake?" I understood what he was asking, and I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I will come." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the world transformed by the snow that had fallen in the night. After breakfast, the Duke and I bundled up in heavy cloaks and walked to the lake. Charlotte remained behind with Mrs. Daventry, occupied with a new puzzle, and I was grateful for the privacy. This was something the Duke needed to do, and I knew that my presence was important, not as a witness, but as a companion. We stood on the shore, near the folly, and he took Eleanor's ring from his pocket. For a long moment, he simply held it, his eyes distant, and I knew he was saying goodbye. Then he drew back his arm and threw the ring as far as he could. It arced through the cold air and disappeared into the water with a small splash, and the ripples spread outward in perfect circles until they were absorbed by the vastness of the lake. He stood there, his breath forming clouds in the air, and I moved closer and took his hand. "She would want you to be happy," I said softly. "She would want Charlotte to have a complete family." "I know," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "but it is still hard to let go." I squeezed his hand, and we stood together in silence, watching the snow begin to fall again, dusting the surface of the lake with white. I thought about how far we had both come, how much we had both lost and survived. And I thought about the spring, when the primroses would bloom, and I would give him my answer. But even then, standing in the cold with his hand in mine, I knew what that answer would be. I had already forgiven him, whether I fully realized it or not. I had already begun to love him again, or perhaps to love him for the first time, not as an arranged match or a romantic fantasy, but as a real man with flaws and regrets and a deep capacity for change. We walked back to the house slowly, our footsteps leaving tracks in the fresh snow, and when we reached the entrance hall, Charlotte came running to meet us, her face bright with excitement. She had something to show us, she said, tugging on her father's hand. Mrs. Daventry had helped her make paper snowflakes, and she had decorated the entire nursery with them. We climbed the stairs together, the three of us, and when we entered the nursery, I saw that she had indeed covered every surface with delicate white cutouts. They hung from ribbons tied to the curtain rods. They were scattered across the table. They adorned the mantelpiece. It was chaotic and childish and absolutely beautiful. "Do you like it?" Charlotte asked anxiously, looking from her father to me. "I love it," the Duke said, and he scooped her up and spun her around, making her shriek with laughter. "It is perfect." I watched them together, father and daughter, and I felt my heart swell with an emotion so powerful it almost hurt. This was what I wanted, this family, this life, this chance to be part of something larger than my own wounded pride. And when the spring came, I would say yes. I would take that ring with my name engraved inside it, and I would wear it, and I would finally allow myself to be happy. But first, there was winter to get through, and I had learned that nothing in life was ever simple or certain. There were still obstacles ahead, still challenges to overcome. But for the first time in 6 years, I believed we could face them together. Winter settled over Ashford Manor with a quiet intensity, transforming the landscape into something stark and beautiful. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the household drew inward, gathering around fires and candles against the darkness. Charlotte thrived in this cocooned atmosphere, her lessons punctuated by snowball fights in the garden and hot chocolate by the nursery fire. I had never been happier, and yet beneath the contentment ran a current of anxiety that I could not entirely shake. The Duke had been true to his word about waiting until spring, but his intentions were clear in everything he did. He found small ways to show his care, leaving books he thought I would enjoy on my writing desk, ensuring that my favorite tea was always available, asking my opinion on matters relating to the estate as if I were already mistress here rather than merely governess. And when we were alone together in the evenings, the air between us was charged with possibility, with the unspoken acknowledgement of what we were building toward. Charlotte, perceptive as always, had begun to sense the shift in our relationship. One afternoon in mid-January, as we worked on her French vocabulary, she looked up at me with sudden seriousness and asked if I was going to marry her papa. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. "What makes you ask that, darling?" She tilted her head, considering. "You look at each other the way Mama and Papa used to look at each other. And Papa smiles now, the way he did before Mama died. And you seem happy, happier than when you first came." I set down the book we had been reading and took her small hands in mine. "Would it make you happy if I did marry your papa?" She was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I miss Mama," she said finally. "I will always miss her, but I think she would like you. And I think she would want Papa to be happy again. And I think I would like having you as my Mama, if you promise not to leave." The last words came out in a rush, and I heard the fear beneath them. This child had lost so much already. Of course she would be afraid of losing more. I pulled her into my arms and held her tight. "I promise," I whispered. "If I become your Mama, I will never leave you. Not ever." She clung to me, and I felt her small body relax against mine. "Then yes," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I would be happy." That evening, I told the Duke about the conversation, and I saw tears glisten in his eyes. "She has not spoken of Eleanor in months," he said quietly. I worried that she was forgetting her, or worse, that she felt she needed to forget her in order to accept someone new. I shook my head. She knows her mother loved her. That knowledge is not going anywhere. But children are resilient in ways adults often are not. They can hold space for grief and joy at the same time. He reached for my hand across the small table where we sat, and I gave it to him. "You are good for her," he said, "and you are good for me. I do not know what I did to deserve this second chance, but I am grateful for it every day." I squeezed his hand, warmed by his words, but before I could respond, we heard rapid footsteps in the corridor outside. Mrs. Daventry appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with agitation. "Your Grace," she said breathlessly, "there are visitors. The Dowager Duchess and Lord Ashford have arrived from London. They are in the drawing room." I felt the Duke's hand tighten on mine before he released it. His mother and brother. I had heard him speak of them occasionally, always with a careful neutrality that suggested complicated relationships. His mother had been devastated by his marriage to Eleanor, I knew, viewing it as a betrayal of family duty and social position. And his younger brother had always resented being the spare, living in the shadow of the Duke's title and fortune. "I should go," I said, rising quickly. "This is a family matter." But the Duke caught my hand again. "No," he said firmly. "Stay. Whatever they have come to say, it concerns you as much as me." I sat back down, my heart pounding, and tried to compose myself as we heard voices in the corridor, drawing closer. Then the door opened, and two figures swept into the room with the kind of presence that suggested they were accustomed to being the center of attention wherever they went. The Dowager Duchess was a tall woman in her 60s, dressed in deep purple silk with an elaborate bonnet and a fur-trimmed pelisse. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. Behind her came a younger man, perhaps 30, with the same gray eyes as the Duke, but a weaker chin and an expression of perpetual dissatisfaction. "Mother," the Duke said, rising to his feet. "Francis, this is unexpected." The Dowager's gaze swept over me, taking in my simple dress and my position at the Duke's table, and her lips thinned. "So the rumors are true," she said, her voice clipped. "You have installed a governess in the house, and now you keep her company in the evenings, like a companion. Have you completely lost your senses, Richard?" I felt my face burn with humiliation, but the Duke's expression remained calm. "Miss Weston is Charlotte's governess, and she is also my friend. I will thank you to speak of her with respect." The dowager laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Your friend? Is that what we are calling it now? Richard, everyone in London is talking about this. They are saying that you have taken up with a woman of no family and no fortune, just as you did before. They are saying that you have learned nothing from the scandal you caused with your first marriage. I started to rise, intending to excuse myself and spare them all this scene, but the Duke gestured for me to stay. I felt trapped, caught between the desire to flee and the need to support him. His brother, Francis, had been watching us with narrowed eyes, and now he spoke for the first time. It is worse than that, Mother. I made inquiries before we left London. Miss Weston is the same Miss Weston to whom Richard was betrothed 6 years ago, the one he jilted publicly to marry the vicar's daughter. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I saw the dowager's eyes widen with shock and then harden with fury. She turned on her son. Tell me this is not true. Tell me you have not brought that woman back into your life, into your home, after the disgrace she represents. She represents no disgrace, the Duke said, his voice dangerously quiet. The disgrace was mine and mine alone, and I will not stand here and listen to you insult her. But the dowager was not finished. Do you have any idea what this looks like? Do you understand what people will say? They will say that you brought her here out of guilt, that you are trying to atone for your sins by marrying her now. They will say that you are weak, that you cannot govern your own household, let alone your estates. And they will be right. I could not remain silent any longer. Forgive me, Your Grace, I said, addressing the dowager directly. But you do not know me, and you do not know what has passed between your son and me. Whatever happens, it will be our decision, made freely and without concern for gossip. She turned on me, her face flushed with anger. Who are you to speak to me in that manner? You are a servant in this house, nothing more. You have no right to an opinion on family matters. I felt the sting of her words, felt the old shame rising up to choke me. But before I could respond, the Duke stepped between us. That is enough, he said, his voice like iron. Miss Weston is not merely a servant. She is the woman I intend to marry, if she will have me. And if you cannot treat her with the respect she deserves, then you are not welcome in this house. The silence that followed was absolute. The dowager stared at her son as if he had struck her, and Francis looked between them with an expression that might have been triumph or glee. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to believe what I had just heard. He had said it aloud, had declared his intentions before his family, before I had given him my answer. It was reckless and impulsive and utterly unlike the careful, controlled man I had come to know. You cannot be serious, the dowager said finally, her voice shaking. You would throw away your position, your reputation, everything we have worked to build, for a woman who brings nothing to this family? She brings everything that matters, the Duke said. She brings kindness and intelligence and a strength that I have come to depend on. And she brings love, though I am still working to earn hers. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I blinked them back. This was not how I had imagined this moment, not surrounded by hostility and recrimination, but perhaps it was fitting. Perhaps love was not meant to be easy or comfortable. Perhaps it required exactly this kind of courage, this willingness to stand firm in the face of opposition. Francis laughed, a bitter sound. You are a fool, brother. You threw away a perfectly suitable match once before for love, and it brought you nothing but grief. Eleanor died, and you were left alone with a child to raise. And now you want to repeat the same mistake with the woman you originally spurned? It is pathetic. Get out, the Duke said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying such force that even Francis took a step back. Both of you, leave my house, and do not return until you can behave with civility. The dowager drew herself up to her full height, every inch the aristocrat. If we leave now, Richard, do not expect us to support you when the scandal breaks. Do not expect us to stand by you when society turns its back. "I have never expected anything from you, Mother," the Duke said wearily, "and I will not start now." She swept from the room, Francis following in her wake, and we heard the front door slam behind them moments later. The silence they left behind was deafening. I sat very still, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand the implications of what the Duke had done. He turned to me, and I saw the vulnerability in his face. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not mean for you to be subjected to that. I did not mean to declare my intentions in such a manner. I know I promised to wait until spring, to give you time." I stood and crossed to him, my heart pounding. "You defended me?" I said softly. "You chose me over your family." "I choose you over anyone," he said simply. "I choose you because you are brave and honest and good, because you make me want to be better, because when I look at you, I see a future worth fighting for." I reached up and touched his face, feeling the tension in his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "Ask me now," I said. "Do not wait for spring. Ask me now." He took my hands in his, and I saw hope and fear warring in his eyes. "Catherine Margaret Weston, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and Charlotte's mother? Will you give me the chance to spend the rest of my life making up for the pain I caused you?" "Yes," I said, and the word came out clear and strong, without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." He pulled me into his arms, and I felt his whole body shaking. I held him tightly, this man who had destroyed me and then rebuilt me, and I knew that we would face challenges ahead. His family would not accept this easily. Society would gossip and judge. There would be those who saw me as a fortune hunter or him as weak and sentimental. But none of that mattered. What mattered was this moment, this choice, this commitment to build something new from the ruins of what had been lost. I had spent 6 years being careful, being safe, protecting myself from pain. And now I was choosing to be vulnerable, to risk everything, because the alternative was to live half a life, always wondering what might have been. When we finally pulled apart, I saw that he was crying, and I reached up to wipe the tears from his face. "We should tell Charlotte," I said. "She will be so happy." He nodded, unable to speak, and together we went up to the nursery. Charlotte was already in her nightgown, sitting up in bed with a book, and she looked up with surprise when we both entered. "Papa," she said. "Miss Weston?" "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," the Duke said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Something is very right. Miss Weston has agreed to marry me. She is going to be your mama." Charlotte's eyes went wide, and then she launched herself at me with such force that I nearly fell over. I caught her and held her close, feeling her small arms wrap around my neck. "You promised," she whispered fiercely. "You promised you would not leave." "And I will not," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I am going to stay forever." She pulled back and looked at her father. "Does this mean we will be a real family again?" "Yes," he said softly. "That is exactly what it means." Charlotte nodded solemnly, as if something important had been settled, and then she smiled, the first truly unguarded smile I had seen from her. "Good," she said, "because I love you both very much, and I want us to stay together always." I tucked her back into bed and kissed her forehead, and the Duke did the same. Then we left her to sleep, her rag doll clutched in her arms and her face peaceful. As we walked back down the corridor, he took my hand. "There will be difficulties ahead," he said. "My mother will not give up easily. And there are others who will see this marriage as inappropriate or scandalous." "I know," I said, "but we will face them together." He stopped and turned to face me, cupping my face in his hands. "I do not deserve you," he said, "but I promise I will spend every day trying to be worthy of this gift you have given me." I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "You already are worthy," I said. "You were brave enough to change, brave enough to admit your mistakes, brave enough to ask for another chance. That is all anyone can do." We stood there in the dim corridor, just the two of us, and I felt the last of my defenses crumble away. I had thought I needed guarantees, promises that I would never be hurt again. But the truth was that love offered no such certainties. It required faith and courage and the willingness to be broken and healed again and again. And I had finally found that courage, not because I was certain of the outcome, but because I believed in us. The next morning, we told Mrs. Daventry and the rest of the household staff about our engagement. Mrs. Daventry's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged me with an affection that surprised me. "I am so glad," she whispered. "This house has needed joy for too long." The news spread quickly through the surrounding neighborhood, and within days, we began receiving visits from local families. Most were genuinely pleased, offering congratulations and good wishes. But some came out of curiosity, wanting to see the woman who had captured the Duke's heart twice. I bore their scrutiny with as much grace as I could manage, knowing that I would need to prove myself worthy of my position. It was during one of these visits from Lady Pemberton and her daughter that I first sensed the depth of the opposition we would face. Lady Pemberton was an elegant woman in her 50s, a widow who held considerable influence in local society. She accepted tea in the drawing room and made polite conversation for several minutes before turning to the real purpose of her visit. "I must confess, Miss Weston," she said, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision, "that I am surprised by this engagement. I had thought, after everything that happened with your previous betrothal, that you might prefer a quieter life." I met her gaze steadily. "I prefer a life that brings me happiness, Lady Pemberton, and I have found that here." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course, but surely you must realize that there will be talk. People will question your motives, wonder if you accepted the Duke out of ambition or revenge. You must be prepared for that scrutiny." "I am prepared for whatever comes," I said calmly. "I know my own heart, and so does the Duke. The opinions of others, while regrettable if negative, will not change our decision." Her daughter, a young woman of perhaps 20, spoke up then. "But Miss Weston, do you not worry about taking the place of the late Duchess? Everyone speaks so highly of her. She was universally loved." I felt the barb beneath the seemingly innocent question, but I refused to rise to it. "I have no intention of replacing her," I said gently. "She was Charlotte's mother, and she will always hold that place in the family's heart. I hope only to honor her memory by caring for the people she loved." Lady Pemberton stood, signaling that the visit was at an end. "Well," she said, gathering her gloves, "I wish you all the best, Miss Weston. You will certainly need it." After they left, I sat alone in the drawing room and felt the weight of what I had taken on. I was marrying not just a man, but a position, a role in society that came with expectations and responsibilities. I would be judged constantly, compared to Eleanor, scrutinized for any sign of inadequacy or presumption. It was daunting, and for a moment, I felt a flutter of doubt. But then I thought of Charlotte's arms around my neck, of the Duke's tears when I accepted him, of the life we were building together, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they were worth facing. I had lived too long in the shadow of other people's expectations. It was time to step into the light, to claim my own happiness, regardless of the cost. That evening, the Duke and I walked to the lake, as had become our habit. The ice had formed along the edges, and the world was hushed with cold. We stood by the folly, looking out at the frozen expanse, and he asked me about Lady Pemberton's visit. I told him what she had said, and I saw his jaw tighten. "She had no right to speak to you that way." "She had every right," I said. "I am not yet your Duchess, and even when I am, I will need to earn the respect of people like her. I cannot simply demand it." He turned to me, his expression fierce. "You have already earned my respect, and Charlotte's love. Nothing else matters." I smiled and took his hand. "Everything else matters, actually, but we will manage it together." He pulled me close, and I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. We stood like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other, and I felt my doubts begin to fade. We would face opposition. We would face gossip and judgment. But we would face it as partners, as equals, and that made all the difference. As we walked back to the house, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, I thought about the spring that was coming, when we would marry and begin our life together. I thought about Charlotte, who would finally have a complete family again. And I thought about the ring that waited in the velvet box, the ring with my name engraved inside, that would soon rest on my finger as a symbol of promises kept and futures redeemed. The winter was not yet over, but I could feel it beginning to loosen its grip, and I knew that when the primroses bloomed in Eleanor's garden, I would stand beside this man and pledge my life to his, not with the naive hope of the girl I had been, but with the hard-won wisdom of the woman I had become. And that would make all the difference. Spring came to Ashford Manor with a slow, deliberate grace, as if the world itself understood the significance of the season. The snow melted first from the south-facing slopes, revealing patches of brown earth that gradually gave way to green. The trees began to bud, their bare branches softening with the promise of leaves. And in Eleanor's garden, beneath the stone bench where she had once sat with her daughter, the primroses began to push through the soil, their pale yellow faces turning toward the strengthening sun. I watched their progress daily, sometimes alone, sometimes with Charlotte, who had taken to checking on them with an almost religious devotion. She would kneel in the damp earth, heedless of her dress, and count the new blooms, announcing each one as if it were a miracle. In a way, I suppose it was. Life returning after the death of winter, hope emerging from dormancy. It seemed a fitting metaphor for everything that had happened. The weeks since our engagement had been both wonderful and difficult. The Duke had written to his mother, informing her formally of our intention to marry, and she had responded with a letter so cold and formal it might have been carved from ice. She would not attend the wedding, she wrote, and she advised him to reconsider before he brought further scandal upon the family name. His brother Francis sent no response at all, which was perhaps more damning than outright opposition. But there were also joys. The local vicar, a kindly man who had known the Duke since childhood, offered to perform the ceremony and expressed genuine happiness at our union. Several neighboring families, including Lord and Lady Hartwick, sent gifts and invitations, signaling their acceptance. And most importantly, Charlotte blossomed like the primroses themselves, her confidence growing as she realized that our little family was truly becoming permanent. I had written to my aunt in London, informing her of my engagement, and her response had been characteristically practical. She was pleased that I had found security, she wrote, and hoped that I would be happy. There was no mention of the past, no acknowledgement of the cruel twist of fate that had brought me back to the man who had once rejected me. But I had not expected emotional depth from her. She had given me shelter when I needed it, and that was enough. As the wedding day approached, I found myself growing increasingly nervous. We had chosen a simple ceremony, to be held in the manor's private chapel with only a handful of witnesses. I had no family to invite, save my aunt, who had declined to travel from London, and the Duke's family would be conspicuously absent. But Charlotte would be there, and Mrs. Daventry, and the handful of people who had shown us genuine kindness. It would be intimate and modest, and I told myself that was exactly what I wanted. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in, when I wondered if we were moving too fast, if I was making a mistake in trusting a man who had hurt me so deeply before. In those moments, I would find myself in the nursery looking at the velvet box that now sat openly on my writing desk. The Duke had given it to me shortly after our engagement, insisting that I should keep it, that it belonged to me now. Inside, only one ring remained. Eleanor's ring was gone, released to the depths of the lake, but my ring was there, waiting. One evening, about a week before the wedding, I sat alone in my room holding the ring and thinking about everything that had led me to this moment. I heard a soft knock at the door, and Charlotte entered, already in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Cannot you sleep, darling?" I asked, setting the ring aside. She shook her head and climbed into my lap, even though she was really getting too big for such things. "I am worried," she said quietly. "About what?" She was silent for a moment, and I could feel her struggling to put her feelings into words. "What if you and Papa stop loving each other? What if you go away like Mama did?" I felt my heart clench with sympathy for this child who had learned too early that nothing was permanent, that love could be lost in an instant. "Oh, Charlotte," I said, holding her tightly, "your Mama did not stop loving you or your Papa. She died, which is very different, and I promise you, I am not going anywhere." "But how do you know?" she persisted. "How can you be sure?" "I cannot be sure of everything," I admitted, because I believed in being honest with her, even about difficult things. "I cannot promise that nothing bad will ever happen, but I can promise that I will do everything in my power to stay with you and your Papa, to build a life with you, to be the mother you deserve." She leaned back and looked at me with those solemn gray eyes. "Do you love Papa?" "I do," I said, and it was the first time I had said it aloud to anyone. "I love him very much. And do you love me?" "I love you more than I can say," I told her. "You are brave and kind and clever, and I am so grateful that I get to be your Mama." She smiled then, and some of the worry eased from her small face. "Good," she said, "because I love you too, and I want you to stay forever." After I tucked her back into bed, I sat for a long time thinking about what she had said. How did I know? How could anyone know that love would last, that promises would be kept? The truth was that I could not know, not with absolute certainty. But I had learned something important in the months I had spent at Ashford Manor. Love was not about certainty. It was about choosing every day to trust and hope and believe. It was about being brave enough to be vulnerable, even when you had been hurt before. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, with the kind of gentle sunlight that seems to promise nothing but good things. I dressed in a gown that the Duke had commissioned for me, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Daventry helped me arrange my hair, pinning it up with small white rosebuds from the conservatory, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She looked happy, I thought. She looked like a bride who was marrying for love. Charlotte appeared at my door, dressed in a new frock of pale blue, and she gasped when she saw me. "You look like a princess," she breathed. "And you look like a princess too," I told her, and it was true. She was glowing with excitement, bouncing on her toes with barely contained energy. "Are you ready?" she asked. I took a deep breath and picked up my bouquet, a simple arrangement of primroses and early roses. "Yes," I said, "I am ready." We walked down together, Charlotte's small hand in mine, and I felt remarkably calm. This was right, I knew. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles we would face, this marriage was the right choice. We entered the chapel, a small stone building attached to the manor, and I saw the Duke standing at the altar with the vicar. He turned as we entered, and the look on his face took my breath away. He was staring at me as if I were something precious and miraculous, as if he could not quite believe I was real. He wore a dark coat and gray waistcoat, and his cravat was tied with unusual care, and I thought I had never seen him look more handsome or more vulnerable. I walked down the short aisle, Charlotte walking beside me rather than behind, because she had insisted she wanted to give me away since I had no father to do it. The Duke held out his hand when we reached him, and I placed mine in his, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. I heard the vicar's words about love and commitment, about the sacred bond of marriage. But mostly I was aware of the man standing beside me, of his hand holding mine, of the way his voice shook slightly when he made his vows. When it came time for him to place the ring on my finger, he lifted my hand and kissed it first. A gesture so tender that I felt tears prick my eyes. The ring slid onto my finger, the gold warm against my skin, and I looked down at the inscription inside. Catherine. My name, waiting all these years to find its proper place. I looked up at the Duke, and I saw that he was crying openly now, making no attempt to hide his tears. I love you, he said, though it was not part of the ceremony. I love you, Catherine, and I will spend every day proving it. I love you too, I whispered back. And then the vicar was pronouncing us husband and wife, and the Duke was pulling me into his arms and kissing me with a passion that made me forget we had an audience. When we finally pulled apart, Charlotte was clapping and laughing, and Mrs. Daventry was wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. We walked back down the aisle together, the three of us, and I felt as if my heart might burst with happiness. This was my family now. This was where I belonged. We had a small wedding breakfast in the dining room with champagne and cake and toasts that made everyone alternately laugh and cry. Charlotte made a speech, laboriously memorized, about how happy she was to have a new mama, and I had to excuse myself to the hallway for a moment to compose myself. The Duke followed me out and found me leaning against the wall, pressing my hands to my flushed cheeks. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern in his voice. "I am more than all right," I said. "I am overwhelmed. I did not think I could feel this happy." He pulled me close, and I rested my head on his shoulder. "Neither did I," he said quietly. "After Eleanor died, I thought happiness was something that had happened to me once and would never happen again. But you have given me hope, Catherine. You have given me a future." "We have given each other a future," I corrected gently. "This is not one-sided. You have given me a home, a family, a purpose. You have given me a reason to believe in love again." We stood there in the hallway, holding each other, and I felt the last remnants of my old bitterness and anger dissolve. I had truly forgiven him now, not because he had earned it through his actions, though he had, but because holding on to that pain no longer served any purpose. It was time to let it go, to step fully into this new life we were building. That evening, after Charlotte had finally been persuaded to go to bed, the Duke and I walked to the lake one last time as we had been. The primroses were in full bloom now, carpeting Eleanor's garden with yellow and white, and the air was sweet with the scent of them. We sat on the stone bench, and he took my hand, running his thumb over the wedding ring on my finger. "I need to tell you something," he said, and there was a seriousness in his tone that made me turn to look at him fully. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "When I commissioned your ring all those years ago, it was not just because I wanted to close that chapter of my life. It was because some part of me knew even then that I had made a terrible mistake. I tried to tell myself that my feelings for Eleanor were so overwhelming that they justified what I had done to you. But the truth was that I was a coward. I was afraid of an arranged marriage, afraid of duty and obligation, and when I met Eleanor and fell in love with her, it seemed like the perfect escape." He paused, and I saw pain in his face. "But you were not just an arrangement to me, Catherine. Even then, during our brief courtship, I saw your kindness, your intelligence, your grace. And some part of me was attracted to you, even as I was falling in love with someone else. That was why the guilt was so unbearable, why I could not face you when I broke our engagement. I knew that I was throwing away something valuable, something I might never find again." I listened in silence, giving him the space to say what he needed to say. "When Eleanor died," he continued, "I was devastated. But beneath the grief was also a terrible realization that I had squandered everything in pursuit of romantic love. I had hurt you, alienated my family, and in the end, I had only 3 short years with Eleanor before she was taken from me. And I thought that was my punishment, that I would spend the rest of my life alone, haunted by my failures." He turned to face me fully. "But then you came here, and I saw the woman you had become. Not the girl I remembered, but someone stronger, wiser, more beautiful in every way. And I realized that perhaps I had been given a second chance, not to undo the past, but to do better in the present. To finally make the choice I should have made years ago, if I had been brave enough to see what was right in front of me. "Are you saying you should have married me instead of Eleanor?" I asked carefully, not sure how I felt about that idea. "No," he said firmly. "I am saying that I made the choices I made, and I cannot regret them entirely because they led me to where I am now. Eleanor gave me 3 beautiful years and a daughter I adore. But I also hurt you terribly, and that is something I will always carry with me. What I am trying to say, inadequately, is that this marriage is not a consolation prize or a way to atone for my sins. It is what I want more than anything in the world. You are what I want." I took his face in my hands and kissed him gently. "I know that," I said. "I believe you, and I want you to know that I am not marrying you out of forgiveness or charity. I am marrying you because you make me happy, because I admire the man you have become, because I love you." He closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against mine. "I do not deserve you," he whispered. "Stop saying that," I said, a note of exasperation in my voice. "You deserve happiness, Richard." "We both do. Can we not simply accept that and move forward?" He laughed softly and kissed me again, deeper this time, and I felt the last barriers between us fall away. We were truly married now, truly committed to this path, and whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. We walked back to the house slowly, savoring the warm evening air and the sense of peace that had settled over everything. When we reached the entrance hall, Mrs. Daventry informed us that Charlotte had finally fallen asleep, though not before extracting a promise that I would come kiss her goodnight, even though she would not be awake to feel it. I went up to the nursery and found her curled in her bed, her rag doll tucked under her arm, and a smile on her sleeping face. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "Good night, my darling girl," and I felt a surge of fierce protective love for this child who had helped heal both her father and me. Then I went to my new room, the Duchess's chambers that had been thoroughly cleaned and redecorated, removing all traces of Eleanor while still maintaining its elegance. My belongings had been moved from the governess's quarters, and my brushes and books looked strange and small in the vast space. But the Duke was there, waiting for me, and when I entered, he held out his hand. I took it, and he pulled me close. "Are you frightened?" he asked softly. "A little," I admitted. "This is all very new. For me as well," he said. "I feel as though I am learning how to live again, how to hope and dream and believe in the future. You have given me that gift, Catherine, and I promise I will treasure it, and you, for the rest of my days." We stood there together, on the threshold of our new life, and I felt a sense of rightness settle over me like a blessing. I had come to this house broken and bitter, seeking only employment and security, but I had found so much more. I had found a family, a purpose, and a love that was deeper and truer than anything I could have imagined at 19. The months that followed were not without their challenges. The Dowager Duchess maintained her distance, and there were some in society who continued to view our marriage with skepticism or disapproval. But there were also triumphs. Charlotte thrived under our combined care, growing more confident and joyful with each passing week. The estate prospered under the Duke's renewed attention, and I found fulfillment in my role as Duchess, using my position to support local charities and to provide opportunities for young women in circumstances similar to what mine had been. And the Duke and I grew closer with each passing day, learning the rhythms of married life, the small intimacies and adjustments that come with building a life together. We argued occasionally, as all couples do, but we learned to talk through our disagreements, to trust each other enough to be honest even when it was uncomfortable. One evening in late summer, as we sat in the library after Charlotte had gone to bed, I found myself thinking about the velvet box that had started everything. It still sat on my writing desk in the Duchess's chambers, though now it was empty, both rings gone. One to the lake, the other to my finger. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked the Duke suddenly. "Do you ever wish you had made different choices?" He looked up from his book, surprised by the question. "Which choices?" "Any of them. All of them." He set down his book and came to sit beside me on the sofa. "I regret the pain I caused you," he said carefully. "I regret my cowardice in how I handled our broken engagement. But do I regret marrying Eleanor? No. She gave me Charlotte, and she taught me what it means to truly love someone. And do I regret bringing you here, convincing you to give me another chance? Not for a single moment." He took my hand and kissed it. "Every choice I made, good and bad, led me to this moment with you, and I would not trade this for anything." I leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek. "I have been thinking about the rings," I said, "about what they represented. Eleanor's ring was about love and loss, about honoring the past, and my ring was about redemption and second chances. But now I realize they are both about the same thing, really. What is that?" "Hope," I said. "The hope that we can survive loss and find joy again. The hope that we can make mistakes and still deserve happiness. The hope that love is not a finite resource that runs out when someone dies, but something that renews itself if we let it." He was quiet for a long moment, and when I looked up, I saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You are right," he said. "That is exactly what they represent. And I am so grateful that you were brave enough to hope, even when I gave you every reason not to." We sat together as the light faded outside, and the lamps were lit throughout the house, and I thought about how far we had both come. I thought about the girl I had been, waiting in her father's drawing room for a bridegroom who never came. I thought about the years of poverty and shame, teaching piano to merchants' daughters and living on my aunt's charity. I thought about arriving at Ashford Manor with nothing but my dignity and my determination to survive. And then I thought about who I was now. The Duchess of Ashford, Charlotte's mother, Richard's wife. A woman who had learned that survival was not enough, that life required the courage to reach for more, to risk heartbreak in pursuit of happiness. I had that happiness now, hard-won and precious, and I would guard it fiercely. Years later, when Charlotte was grown and married herself, she would ask me about those early days, about how I found the strength to forgive her father and start again. And I would tell her the truth, that forgiveness was not a single moment, but a series of small choices, made daily, to let go of bitterness and embrace possibility. I would tell her that love was not about perfection or certainty, but about showing up again and again, even when it was difficult. But that was still to come. On that summer evening, sitting in the library with my husband, I knew only that I was happy, truly and completely happy, for the first time since childhood. The past was settled, the future uncertain but promising, and the present was full of warmth and light and love. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "I had a bad dream," she said, and I climbed out of bed without thinking and went to her, gathering her into my arms. "You are safe, darling," I murmured. "Papa and I are right here." The Duke joined us, and the three of us stood there in the library, holding each other, and I thought about the 2 rings that had brought us together. One resting at the bottom of the lake, releasing the past. One on my finger, claiming the future. And between them, this moment, this family, this life we had built from the wreckage of broken promises and shattered dreams. I had found 2 wedding rings in the nursery, and one of them was never mine, or so the Duke had said. But he was wrong. Both rings had been mine, in a way. Eleanor's ring represented the path not taken, the life I might have had if things had gone differently. And my ring represented the path I had chosen, the life I had built through perseverance and courage and faith. And standing there with my husband and daughter, I knew that I would not change anything. Every heartbreak, every disappointment, every moment of doubt had led me here to this perfect, imperfect, beautiful moment. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.